It began with an amount most people wouldn't think twice about spending on a weekend trip or a few dinners out, $1,000. For me, though, that sum wasn't casual spending. It was the seed of a bigger dream, one I'd harbored quietly while working a modest 9-to-5 job that paid the bills but didn't stir the soul. I had always been fascinated by the idea of building wealth through investment, of placing a bet on something meaningful and watching it grow, not just financially, but in purpose. The opportunity presented itself in an ordinary conversation with a friend over coffee. He spoke with a kind of confidence that's hard to ignore, a spark in his eyes as he described a new tech startup he'd recently become involved with. The founders were visionaries, he said. The concept was revolutionary, a platform that used artificial intelligence to streamline small business operations, promising to save time, reduce costs, and disrupt the industry. Words like that, disrupt, revolutionize, visionary, they had a strange power over me. They made me feel like I was about to be part of something big. "You don't want to miss this," he said, nudging his phone toward me to show me a pitch deck full of charts, buzzwords, and glowing testimonials from beta users. "They're opening up a new investment round for friends and early believers. Just a few thousand to get in." I didn't have a few thousand. But I had saved $1,000 over the past year, money I hadn't earmarked for anything specific. It sat in my savings account, growing slowly with negligible interest, untouched and, frankly, underappreciated. I looked at it differently now. What if that $1,000 could become $10,000? Or even more? Of course, I knew investing had risks. I'd read the headlines about startups failing, about fraud, about people losing everything. But those stories felt distant, like cautionary tales meant for people who ignored the obvious warning signs. I convinced myself this wasn't one of those stories. After all, I wasn't going in blind, I had a friend who vouched for it, a personal connection. That had to mean something. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over the idea. I read every piece of material the startup had released, watched interviews with the founders, browsed LinkedIn to verify their professional histories. Everything seemed promising. The product was still in development, but the roadmap looked solid. The founders were articulate and passionate. They even had a sleek website and a Medium blog that detailed their mission to democratize automation for the little guy. But in hindsight, what I did wasn't real due diligence. I didn't dig into the competition. I didn't analyze the business model critically. I didn't talk to a financial advisor or an experienced investor. I looked for signs that confirmed what I wanted to believe, that this was a golden ticket. And, of course, I found them. Confirmation bias has a funny way of hiding the truth behind excitement. So, I made the leap. The transfer was simple. A click here, a signature there, and just like that, I was an investor. It felt strange, almost surreal. I wasn't just watching others build something anymore, I was part of it. I imagined the future me, telling people how I took a chance before anyone else saw the potential. I pictured interviews where I'd be asked how I knew. I'd smile and say something about gut instinct and timing. I didn't tell many people. A few close friends, mostly the same ones who'd heard me rant about wanting to take control of my finances. Some were supportive. Others gave me that polite smile people wear when they don't want to discourage you but don't quite believe in your plan either. "It's risky," my older sister had said over the phone when I told her. "Just make sure you're okay if you lose it." I had nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I thought I was okay with it. I told myself that $1,000 wasn't life-changing money. But the truth was, it mattered more to me than I admitted. It wasn't just the cash, it was what it represented, my leap of faith, my first real attempt at shaping a different future. The first few weeks after investing were electric. The startup sent out regular email updates, polished newsletters with slick graphics and confident language. They announced new partnerships, expanding beta trials, and social media buzz. I'd check their Twitter feed daily, searching for signs of momentum. Each like, each retweet, felt like a step closer to success. There was even a short-lived online community of early investors, most of us novices who bonded over our mutual excitement. We called ourselves the First Believers. There were Zoom calls, Discord chats, even plans to meet up if things went well. It was more than investing, it was belonging. And for a time, I rode that high. Looking back now, I realize how easily excitement can mask uncertainty. I ignored the absence of any real financial statements. I rationalized the lack of the working prototype. I told myself that startups are messy, that progress comes in bursts. But if I'm being honest, part of me was too afraid to look too closely. I didn't want to find flaws. I didn't want to admit that my dream might be built on shaky ground. Still, at that point, everything felt possible. My $1,000 had become more than money, it had become a symbol of hope, of potential, of stepping out of my comfort zone. I had no idea how much I was about to learn, the hard way. The first real sign of trouble was subtle, an email that arrived 2 days later than expected. Until then, the startup had been almost clockwork in its communication. Weekly updates, investor insights, founder blogs, all polished, all timed perfectly. But that week, nothing came. I waited, refreshing my inbox more times than I'd like to admit. When the email finally appeared, it was shorter, vaguer, and missing the usual cheery tone. There was no mention of progress, just a vague reference to unexpected delays and a strategic pause to assess development timelines. It wasn't alarming, not yet. Startups faced hurdles, that much I understood. But the silence that followed began to eat away at my optimism. The online investor group I joined, once buzzing with hope and shared ambition, began to change too. A few people asked questions. Anyone else notice we haven't heard about the beta launch? Does anyone have direct contact with the founders? The responses were vague. Some said to trust the process, while others began expressing concern. Still, I tried to stay positive. I told myself that innovation takes time. Maybe they were pivoting. Maybe they were dealing with something internal and didn't want to raise false alarms. I clung to any explanation that allowed me to believe my investment was still on track. Then the departures started. First, it was the chief technology officer. An update mentioned he had left to pursue other ventures, with no further details. Then, 2 more team members vanished from the About Us page on the website. No public announcements, no replacement hires. Just gone. My friend, the one who'd introduced me to the startup, didn't have any clear answers either. When I asked about the changes, he shrugged it off. Growing pains, he said. This happens all the time in early-stage companies. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried. I began digging deeper, this time with less bias and more intent. I went back to the pitch deck I'd seen on day one, trying to connect promises to progress. The projected timelines for product development had already passed, with no working app or platform available. The promised beta release date was now a full month behind. Their once active Twitter account had gone silent. Their Medium blog hadn't posted in weeks. The founder's LinkedIn page still boasted of rapid growth, but there was no substance to back it up. I even reached out to a couple of other early investors I'd met online. One of them, a software engineer, told me he had walked away emotionally after noticing too many holes in the architecture and sensing that the leadership was improvising. We were sold a vision, he said. But they didn't have the infrastructure or maturity to build it. That's common, man. Most startups fail, you know that, right? I did. At least, I thought I did. I'd heard the statistics, over 90% of startups don't survive their first 5 years. But I never thought mine would be one of them. That's the thing about optimism, it doesn't factor in probability. It just believes. The hardest part was the waiting. There was no dramatic crash, no news headline declaring the company bankrupt or shut down. Just a slow, creeping silence. Updates stopped. My emails went unanswered. The company's website eventually changed. The flashy landing page was replaced with a "We're undergoing internal restructuring" message and a form to contact support that no one replied to. 3 months after I'd made my investment, the writing was on the wall. There would be no product launch. No disruption. No revolutionary tool to automate small businesses. Just a vague trail of online remnants, like digital footprints leading to a door that no longer opened. My $1,000 was gone. There was no formal announcement of closure. Just complete stillness, the kind that says more than any message could. I felt foolish. Betrayed, not by the company, but by myself. I had walked in with eyes half open, seeing only what I wanted to see. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the shame. The realization that I had ignored the warning signs. That I had let emotion overpower logic. That I had trusted too quickly and researched too little. I had no one to blame but myself, and that's a hard pill to swallow. For days, I didn't talk about it. I avoided financial forums, stopped checking my email, even ignored texts from the few friends who knew about the investment. I buried the experience like a bad memory, hoping it would disappear if I just stopped thinking about it. But it didn't. Because that loss, as painful as it was, became the turning point. It forced me to confront something deeper than bad judgment. I had invested not just money, but belief. I had tried to skip steps, to shortcut the process of learning by making a bold move too early. And the universe, in its harsh wisdom, had handed me a lesson I wouldn't forget. I wasn't alone in this. That realization came slowly, as I began reading stories online of others who had made similar mistakes. People who had invested too much, trusted the wrong people, or jumped into hype without a plan. Some had lost far more than I had. But they had come back smarter, stronger, and I wanted to be one of them. So I stopped sulking. I grabbed a notebook and wrote down every mistake I made, not to wallow in regret, but to make sure I didn't repeat them. It was humbling, but necessary. Here's what I learned. Never invest in something you don't fully understand. Don't put more money into one venture than you can afford to lose. Always verify claims, especially when made with enthusiasm and charisma. Emotion has no place in due diligence. Diversification is more than a buzzword, it's survival. I started to see my failed investment not as a dead end, but as a detour. A very expensive, very personal course in what not to do. And somewhere in that quiet reflection, a new thought began to form. What if this failure could be the foundation of something better? Failure has a funny way of changing you. It strips away illusions. It humbles you. But if you're open to it, it also teaches. Once the sting of the loss began to fade, I found myself driven not by anger or embarrassment anymore, but by curiosity. I wanted to know what I had done wrong, exactly. I needed to understand how others succeeded, and how I could get back in the game, smarter, stronger, and with a plan. The first step was admitting that I didn't know enough. It sounds obvious, but ego can be a stubborn gatekeeper. I had thought I could wing it. That investing was just a matter of feeling out the right opportunity. Now I understood, intuition helps, but knowledge builds the structure where instincts can thrive safely. So I started reading. I picked up every book I could find on personal finance, startup investing, and behavioral economics. Titles like The Intelligent Investor, Angel, and Thinking, Fast and Slow became my companions. I highlighted paragraphs, scribbled notes in the margins, and spent evenings reading case studies of people who had succeeded, and failed, in venture investing. What surprised me wasn't how much there was to learn, but how little I had previously known. I also took online courses. Platforms like Coursera and Udemy offered beginner-friendly introductions to angel investing, equity crowdfunding, and financial analysis. I finally understood terms I had once pretended to grasp: burn rate, runway, cap table, dilution, due diligence. The world that once seemed like a blur of flashy presentations and buzzwords now started to make sense. At the same time, I joined several online communities dedicated to investing. Reddit forums like r/investing and r/startups. Facebook groups for beginner investors. Discord servers filled with people dissecting business models late into the night. I didn't just lurk, I asked questions, shared my failure story, and invited honest feedback. To my surprise, the responses weren't mocking or judgmental. They were understanding, even encouraging. "Welcome to the club," one user replied. "You lost $1,000? Consider that your tuition fee. Now let's make sure you get your degree." That stuck with me. As months passed, my confidence grew. I didn't rush to invest again. In fact, I was now far more cautious than before. I started tracking startups for fun, reading pitch decks and imagining how I'd vet them if I were putting in real money. I followed founders on Twitter and watched how they spoke about their companies. I studied patterns, what successful startups had in common, what red flags had preceded failures. Eventually, I created a simple checklist for myself. A system. Every time I looked at a potential investment, I would ask, do I understand what this company actually does? Is the team credible and experienced? Do they have real traction, or just a vision? Are their projections realistic or hyped? What's their burn rate? Their business model? Would I use this product? Would others? I also set strict rules. I wouldn't invest more than 5% of my savings in any single venture. I would diversify. I would always sleep on a decision, no more impulsive transfers after an exciting conversation. My second investment came almost a year after the first, and this time, it felt entirely different. It was a small, local company building an AI-powered bookkeeping assistant for freelancers and small business owners. The product was already live in beta with hundreds of users. The founder had 10 years of experience in accounting tech and spoke with clarity, not just charisma. When I asked questions, he gave data. When I asked about competitors, he didn't dodge, he explained their strengths and how they plan to differentiate. I didn't put in much. Just $500. But it wasn't about the amount. It was about the process, the fact that I had done the research, verified the facts, and made a calculated decision. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was investing. Over the next few months, I made a few more micro investments through crowdfunding platforms that allowed minimum entries as low as $100. Each time, I did my homework. Some companies fizzled out, others showed slow but steady progress. I started tracking my portfolio with spreadsheets, noting updates, milestones, lessons learned. One of the best tools I added to my arsenal was reflection. After each decision, I would sit down and write why I invested, what I expected, and how I would respond if things didn't go to plan. It was part journal, part accountability exercise. And it helped me stay grounded. But perhaps the most important shift wasn't in my knowledge, it was in my mindset. I no longer saw investing as a shortcut to wealth. I didn't expect instant returns or lottery-like gains. I saw it as planting seeds. Some would never grow. Others might take years. But over time, if I nurtured the soil with knowledge and patience, something would bloom. The fear of failure that once haunted me had been replaced by a quiet confidence. Not arrogance, just the understanding that I could recover from mistakes, and more importantly, learn from them. Interestingly, that same friend who had introduced me to the failed startup reached out again. He had a new opportunity, another game changer. I listened, politely this time, and then asked for the pitch deck, financials, and product roadmap. I gave him a list of questions. He wasn't prepared. Not like last time. He stumbled through answers and relied heavily on excitement rather than substance. When I passed on the opportunity, he seemed surprised. "You've changed," he said. I smiled. That's the point. By the end of that year, my portfolio hadn't exploded in value. In fact, it was modest, maybe a few $100s up overall. But it wasn't about the gains. It was about the foundation. I had rebuilt my approach from the ground up, brick by brick. The loss of that first $1,000 had shaken me, but it didn't break me. In many ways, it was the best money I ever spent, not because of what I got, but because of who I became. It started with a tweet. Buried in a thread of startup pitches and demo day recaps was a single sentence that caught my eye: "We're using machine learning to help nonprofits optimize fundraising campaigns, early traction is promising." It didn't have flashy buzzwords. It didn't promise to change the world overnight. But something about it felt grounded. I clicked through to the company's profile. The founder had posted updates regularly, not marketing fluff, but real, behind-the-scenes progress. Screenshots of the dashboard, snippets of feedback from nonprofits, humble reports on what was working and what wasn't. It was refreshingly honest. So I did what I had trained myself to do, I researched. Their product was a SaaS platform that analyzed donor behavior and suggested personalized fundraising strategies for small to mid-sized nonprofits. The space wasn't as sexy as crypto or AI avatars, but it was real. A clear problem, a clear market, and a solution already in use. The company had 10 paying clients, all small nonprofits that reported increased donations within 3 months of using the service. It was bootstrapped for the first year, and now they were raising a small seed round to scale. I requested the pitch deck. It was lean and focused, not over-designed. They weren't looking for a moonshot, they were building for sustainability. When I read the founder's background, it all clicked. She had spent a decade in the nonprofit world, frustrated by the lack of modern tools. She wasn't just chasing funding, she was solving a problem she had lived. I joined a webinar QA with other potential investors. She answered questions with a calm authority, never overselling, never dodging. When asked about risks, she outlined them clearly and shared how they were preparing for those scenarios. After the session, I reviewed my checklist. White check mark emoji, understandable product and purpose. White check mark emoji, experienced and credible team. White check mark emoji, real users with feedback. White check mark emoji, sustainable business model. White check mark emoji, personal belief in the mission. All boxes checked. I invested $1,200. It wasn't a huge amount by traditional standards, but for me, it marked a full circle. I was back to putting over $1,000 into a single startup, but this time, not from excitement or blind faith. This time, it was based on evidence, instinct and analysis. The 3 pillars I now trusted. What followed over the next year was unlike anything I had experienced with my earlier ventures. Every quarter, the company sent out detailed investor reports, revenue charts, customer churn rates, marketing spend, product development timelines. Not just the good news, but the challenges too. Their honesty built trust. I felt like I was on a journey with them, not just a bystander. 6 months after my investment, they signed their biggest client yet, a national nonprofit that planned to roll out the platform to all its chapters. Revenue jumped. They expanded their team carefully, adding a head of customer success and a part-time CTO. They didn't burn through cash to chase growth. They built steadily. I even referred a nonprofit I volunteered for. They loved it. That was the moment I truly believed I had invested in something meaningful, not just profitable. That was the dream all along. By year's end, I received my first real return, a small dividend distribution as part of a profit-sharing pilot the company launched for early investors. It wasn't massive, a few $100s, but it was more than I had lost on my first startup. More importantly, it was real. I reinvested most of it back into other small ventures. Not because I was chasing the next big win, but because I had finally internalized the principle of long-term thinking. Investing wasn't about one lucky shot. It was about discipline, learning, and resilience. The psychological transformation was even more significant than the financial one. I no longer feared mistakes. I understood they were part of the process, not something to be ashamed of, but something to learn from. I had conversations with strangers online, telling them my full story, including the early failure, in hopes of helping them avoid the same pitfalls. Eventually, I was invited to a small online panel for beginner investors. It felt surreal, being asked for advice. I wasn't an expert. I still made mistakes. But I had something valuable to offer, perspective from both sides of the coin. When someone asked, "What's the best advice you can give someone thinking about investing in startups?" I paused and thought back to where I began. I answered, "Start small. Don't chase hype. Learn constantly. And above all, don't just invest in companies. Invest in your own ability to make decisions." That answer surprised even me. But it was true. The real investment wasn't in that first $1,000 or the second or third startup. It was in the time, effort, and humility I had put into transforming how I thought, how I analyzed risk, and how I valued growth. As I closed the laptop after that panel, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the wild high of imagined success, but the grounded satisfaction of someone who had fallen, stood up, and kept going. My journey wasn't over. There would be more wins, more losses, more uncertain bets. But now I had a compass, and the confidence to use it. A few years ago, if you'd asked me what success looked like, I might have painted a picture of fast profits, luxury purchases, and a lifestyle of freedom fueled by lucky breaks. Today, success means something else entirely: clarity, consistency, and the ability to weather the storms that inevitably come. By now, I had a small but growing portfolio of startup investments. Some of them were barely moving, slowly building towards something uncertain. Others showed modest promise. One or two might eventually become big wins. But I wasn't fixated on that anymore. I had learned to play the long game. What mattered more was how I had grown. I understood markets better, yes, but I also understood myself. I had become the kind of person who asked tough questions before jumping into anything. I no longer confused momentum with substance or charisma with competence. That shift had transformed not just how I invested, but how I lived. Interestingly, the people around me started noticing. Friends who once dismissed investing as too risky began asking questions. Family members who'd been skeptical when I lost my first $1,000 now came to me for help making financial decisions. I didn't claim to be a guru. I simply shared what I had learned, the mistakes, the systems, the mindset. One friend, Emma, was particularly hesitant. She had saved up some money but feared losing it all like everyone does. I sat with her, just as others had once done for me, and walked her through the basics. We looked at her goals, her risk tolerance, her interests. We didn't rush. We created a plan. A few months later, she made her first micro-investment, not because I convinced her, but because she felt prepared. That was a quiet moment of pride. Not because I helped someone invest, but because I helped someone overcome fear with knowledge, just as I had once done for myself. The most surprising change, however, was internal. I became more comfortable with uncertainty. I no longer panicked at volatility or silence from a founder. I knew what questions to ask, when to press for answers, and when to let time do its work. I also became more generous, not just with advice, but with support for causes I believed in. Some of my investments were no longer about returns at all, they were about backing ideas that aligned with my values. One example was a startup focused on mental health access for underserved communities. Their product wasn't flashy, and their financial projections were modest. But the founder's story moved me. She had built the platform after losing her brother to untreated depression. Her mission wasn't to scale fast, it was to save lives. I invested. Not because I thought it would make me rich, but because I believed it mattered. That, too, was a kind of return. As the years passed, I kept evolving. I journaled my decisions. I reviewed my portfolio every quarter. I added new tools and techniques. But more importantly, I continued to see every experience, gain or loss, as a lesson. In one particularly introspective moment, I opened that old notebook, the one where I'd written down all my early mistakes. I read through the pages slowly. I saw the confusion, the emotion, the raw embarrassment of not knowing what I was doing. But I also saw the turning point, the moment when I decided not to give up, when I turned failure into fuel. That's the thing most people don't understand about investing. Yes, it's about numbers and strategies. But it's also about personal growth. It's about how you respond when things go wrong. It's about the discipline to delay gratification, the humility to accept what you don't know, and the willingness to keep learning. Today, I still lose money sometimes. Not every bet works out. But I win far more often, because I now invest with clarity, not emotion. I ask better questions. I know when to walk away. I know when to say no. And when I say yes, it means something. Looking back, I can see how that first failed startup, the one that vanished without warning, shaped everything that followed. It was painful, yes. But it was also a beginning. A rough, reluctant, vital beginning. I often tell people now, don't be afraid of failing early. Be afraid of never starting. If you're willing to fail, learn, and try again, you'll go farther than most. So, here's what I've come to believe. Your first investment probably won't make you rich. But it will teach you something important. Mistakes are not the end, they are the entry fee for growth. You don't need a finance degree to invest, you need curiosity, discipline, and humility. The real return on investment isn't just in dollars, it's in wisdom, resilience, and self-trust. Today, my life looks different than it did when I took that first $1,000 risk. I'm not wealthy, not yet. But I'm wiser. More intentional. And perhaps most importantly, I'm not afraid of falling anymore. Because now I know how to get back up.